Morning, everybody. Welcome to Orangeville Baptist Sunday School, and we're glad to have you joining us today. All right, we're going to be in Genesis chapter 1, and a couple of things we previously talked about. So, like, Genesis is written as a historical account. Am I able to stand up? Is that out of angle? Okay. Well, I'm going to stand for a second. We'll get this figured out. So Genesis chapter 1 is a historical account, and it is the creation account. And what I mean by that is we have said that there are some false misnomers in scholarship today, actually scholarship, that there are other creation accounts in the Bible. What I mean by this is there's only one account where God explains through his word systematically as a historical narrative how he created the universe, the earth, space, time, everything. And that is in Genesis chapter 1. The other one that they cite as a creation account is Job. But we know Job is not a creation account. Job is poetic literature, probably written sometime shortly after the flood, after the Tower of Babel, during what young Earth creationists would agree with this, that there was an ice age, but it's just a matter of the ice age was not as long as what secular scientists would say, and the ice age probably followed the flood, which we will get to. I'll give you some evidence for an ice age, how we see it in the Bible. I do think it's actually seen within the wording of Job. But Job is describing aspects in a poetic way about the creation, but it is not meant to be a systematic, historical narrative, actual, literal interpretation of what the creation was. So there is a difference. So that means we can look to Job as like, oh, this is interesting. Okay, so he's commenting on creation, but we can't look at Job as a systematic day-by-day narrative, which some try to do. We have to go to Genesis first and then interpret Job in light of what we read in Genesis. Okay, so that's the big key. There are some people who like to interpret Genesis in light of what Job reads. Now, is Job technically older? Yes and no. So the authorship of Job is sometime after the Tower of Babel, which we'll discuss years when that could have been, but sometime after the Tower of Babel. There is evidence to suggest that Moses did not actually write the early portions of, I don't want to say he wrote them, but what he did was Moses actually compiled Genesis, and there's a difference. What this means is historians, Old Testament historians, believe that Moses was using very, very ancient tablets that had been handed to him over time, had probably made their way down from Abraham based on certain evidence within Genesis, and prior to Abraham. So we're talking very old documents that are older than Job that Moses would have been compiling and putting together. So in a way, Genesis, the first chapters, is actually older than Job. It is the source material it's based on is very, very ancient. So we have to understand this. Job was written before Genesis, but Genesis is based on source material that is very, very ancient and is even older than Job is, okay? Now, what I believe happened with Genesis, and before we get into the text, this is some history I guess we're starting with. I believe, and I think we can prove this by looking at the text, I think that the early parts of Genesis were given to Adam by God about the creation. I think that if you look throughout Genesis, like Shem, so one of the sons of Noah, Abraham, all of these different people mentioned in Genesis, I believe, wrote accounts and left them behind. And I believe Moses eventually came hold of these accounts and put them together. I think that's how Genesis was created. There's two different views on it. There's some people that say Genesis is more like storytelling, But that I don't think that actually fits with how it is written. So it's a compilation of documents. Yes.
Two things. One is this is not an abnormal thing. The book of Luke was compiled the same way. Dr. Luke set out, and he himself did not. He gathered witnesses and information that was already existing. So this is not like an extraordinary thing. The other thing is that Moses, I believe providentially, was sent into Egypt, received the best education possible, so that he was qualified to compile all of these things. God knew what he was doing. The other thing is, I concur with you, is the word Toledoth in Hebrew, in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, uses the word Genesis. That's why in Matthew he says about the generations, the word Genesis. So Toledoth and Genesis, that's how Genesis got its name. My point is, this is not, we have to view this as a historical account, because as he stated last week, chapters 1 through 11 is extremely under attack. It's because if you can uproot, I think it's, what is it, Psalm 11:1, or no, Psalm 11:4 says, if the foundations are destroyed, what will the righteous do? The world wants to destroy this right here, Genesis 1 through chapter 11.
Sorry, I didn't want my discussion board 4 assignment on the board there. All right. So Genesis chapter 1 is this historical account. We've said that Genesis 2:4, in fact, let's go there really quick. Just check out Genesis 2:4. There we go. Yeah, so what, my version here, this is the King James. Let's go, I do this every week. Hang on a second. 2:4, I study it out of the New King James. That's the only reason why. I actually like the King James better as far as accuracy to the original text. But I like both. Both are very good. But I studied out of this version, so I'm used to seeing that. This is the history of the heavens and the earth when they were created in the day that the Lord made the earth and the heavens. So here's the thing with this. When we're looking at this, that word history is the one we discussed last week, which we don't have to get into in a ton of detail now, but that's a word meaning Toledoth, and this is how we know what genre Genesis is. Genesis is a history or a genealogy of the heavens and the earth. It is meant to be read as a literal historical narrative. Now, in order to understand any book in the Bible, you have to understand the kind of literary style it's written in. That is one of the first aspects of interpreting any kind of document. You have to understand the context. So, looking at any kind of historical study, and this is the stuff that kind of loses people sometimes, because this isn't, some people aren't necessarily interested in it, but to understand a book, you have to understand the purpose for which it was written. You have to really understand what kind of literary style it is, because that's going to determine how you read it, okay? So you have books like the Psalms or the Proverbs that are written as poetic literature. Those are meant to be interpreted not always literally, okay? The Gospels are historical biographies of Jesus of Nazareth. That's how they're meant to be read as historical biographies. But the sayings of Jesus in the parables, we have to understand there's a lot of symbolism there. That all comes with understanding the kind of books that are written. In this case, the reason I'm pointing this out is because there's a lot of people, even commentaries, as you're reading them, even different versions of the Bible, what they'll put as a heading for Genesis 1 is, they'll put a hymn of creation. That's what they'll put. They'll put that as a hymn of creation. That is reading into the text. This is not a hymn. This is not something that early Jews were singing. This is not something that was meant to be put with stringed instruments and other stuff like that. So as we are looking at this, this is not a hymnal. This is not some sort of poetic song, okay? Because if it was a poetic song, that could open the door for, this is symbolic. This is stuff that's not to be meant to be read literally. Or There's some people that even suggest this is written as mythology, Christian mythology or Jewish mythology. Those types of things are refuted by Genesis 2:4. Genesis 2:4 tells us, Moses is literally telling us, this is what I'm writing. This is how I want you to read it. This is how I want you to understand it. So it's not enough to just say, well, this is what we think it should mean because we have to fit millions of years into the Bible. It's, how did Jews interpret this when Moses wrote it to them? How did he mean for them to read it? And I would argue he meant for them to read this as a historical account. And so that's the key with this. So that's huge. Let's get back to Genesis 1, though. Genesis 1, okay. Let's go down the list here. So last week we said, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. We said this is the beginning of space, time, and matter, okay? Space, time, and matter. You have, obviously, beginning is time, heavens is space, earth is matter. Now, go to Genesis, look at Genesis 1:2 here. You have this phrase, the earth, okay? This is what you call a transitionary phrase, okay? What this does is, this ties in Genesis 1:1 with 1:2 directly, okay? And I will say this, Jewish tradition interprets this not only literally, but they also interpret this the following way. Genesis 1:2 is a looking more specifically at what Genesis 1:1 is talking about. Now, why do we point that out? We point that out because of the fact that there are some people who suggest that there's a gap between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. They'll read this and they'll say, they'll look at this and they'll try to suggest that that beginning part of Genesis 1:2 implies some sort of passage of time in there. Now, there are some problems with that, okay? First of all, that theory was created literally to accommodate for the age of the earth. When people in the 1800s started teaching that the earth was old, that it could be 4.5 billion years old or whatever it is, because that number has changed quite a bit over the years, they looked and they said, what spot in Genesis can we use to accommodate these long eras of geological time, which are faulty, but to go through line by line of why they don't work is a little off topic, unfortunately. So we're just going to talk about like the gap for now, okay? We may do apologetics at a different time where we like go through and tear down evolutionary thought and stuff. I have no problem with that, but unfortunately it will lead us down a rabbit trail we don't want to go down. But looking at this, just from the text, the earth there and the earth here, this is put there on purpose. Yeah. This ties these two verses together, grammatically speaking. And so what that means is there is no gap. Moses is simply saying he created the heavens and the earth, and now he's saying, and the earth, as he created it, was without form and void. He's not saying 3.5 billion years passed, and then the earth was somehow void and all this other stuff. Yes?
They also say that Genesis 2 is a recreation of the earth.
Yeah, and maybe
they can say.
Well, yeah.
Yes.
But that's what they say.
Well, and the other thing is that
they need to get it.
Hey, that Hebrew word, the earth was, is a very tricky word because was they want to change it to became, which it can mean became, but the problem with that is you have to look at the rest of it, and you're going to get into tohu and bohu.
Whatever that is.
I don't even know what those are.
Well, formless and without form and void.
Oh yeah.
In Hebrew is tohu bohu.
Yeah. I wasn't going to get into the Hebrew of it, but I was going to.
No, but what I mean by that is, well, because that word tohu and bohu, they say means devastated and without and utter destruction.
Yeah.
Instead of just going with the classical meaning, which means without form and void.
So let me explain how I would interpret this. Okay. So I would say that the fact of a gap, any of that stuff is rubbish. It was added in later to accommodate for years. Okay, I think to dance that dance, you really have to have some lively music going, because that's a dance that is just completely fabricated. Okay, so the text, the way early Jews interpreted it, it was never interpreted that way by Hebrew scholars. It still isn't today. It's not a respected view, I would say, within like Orthodox Judaism. But it's people in the West who are like, oh, dinosaurs are this old, and so now, the earth is this old, so now we have to start accommodating. But you can't do that, because what we're finding now is there's actually really good reasons why we determined that like certain fossils and things are that old. And actually they aren't that old, which we can get to. But the problem with compromising is, like, once you compromise, then it's like, oh, now I'm committed to following this path, and it's like, you should have just trusted the Bible all along, because the Bible got it right. Why would we trust fallible humans over what God has said, plainly? And so they will try to add stuff in, but one of the aspects of this is what they imply, and here's the thing and here's also why they're wrong. Okay, I've heard people suggest this. What they try to say is that, and bear with me because this is a lot, but they try to argue that somewhere between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 is when the angels fell and they had this great angelic war. That is false. Okay, and I will tell you why. Because that would make the earth, if there was in fact billions of years here, because there was even some young earth creationists who will say there was this great fall of Satan between 1:1 and 1:2. But we're young earth creationists. We believe the earth is young and all this other stuff. And I'm like, well, how do you accommodate for like just an infinite amount of time between Genesis 1 and 1? That would make the earth not young. Well, the thing with these people is they say, well, time doesn't start until verse 2. What's wrong with that? Saying time doesn't start until verse 2.
Because both of them are one.
It says in verse 1, in the beginning.
Yeah.
That means time has started in verse 1.
You can't break the two verses up.
You can't. And you can't say that time just doesn't start till verse 2. And I will also argue this. The angels, now we don't know much about the fall of Lucifer. I would say it takes place sometime after day 6 of creation. There is day 6 of creation in Genesis 1. And so yeah, I would argue that the angels fell sometime after God finished creating things. Now, God purposely has not given us a ton of information. He's given us what we need to know.
Yeah, that's right.
But we don't know everything about when this took place. But we can say that it did take place within the books, obviously, after Genesis chapter 1, the 6th day of creation. It had to have, okay? And here's the reason why. Angels could not have existed prior to Genesis 1:1. It's impossible. Because some people have suggested that angels existed before Genesis 1:1. That is impossible. And I will tell you why. Angels, you think about this for a second. You ever notice that angels, like in Daniel, they get held up by other angels when they're fighting, or they get stopped, or an angel will travel from one place to another? Mm-hmm. What does that imply about angels? Angels can't be in two places at one time.
Correct.
Angels have to move through time and space. Angels are a created being that are contingent on time and space. Angels cannot exist outside of time and space. So to imply that they were around before Genesis 1:1 is to imply that angels are transcendent like God is transcendent. Nothing can exist prior to Genesis 1:1. Everything had to have been created after Genesis 1:1, or simultaneously with Genesis 1:1's time, space, and matter. And so what we have to understand, I know this is like deep, but a lot of people ask us, when were angels created? It could not have been possible that they were created prior to Genesis 1:1. And so what we also have to recognize is there's a huge issue with saying that Satan rebelled somewhere between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. Because after all, what does God call his creation in Genesis chapter 1?
Perfect.
He
Very
calls
good.
it very good, perfect,
Not
complete.
just good, but very good.
Yes, and the thing is, if Genesis 2 is a recreation, or some will even say this is a recreation, that would make God a liar when he says that this creation is very good. How could he call a creation very good that is infused with the memory of sin, of this rebellion? How could that be possible without making God a liar?
It wouldn't be a memory, it would be present.
Right. It is. I'm not going to say it's heresy, because there are genuinely faithful believers who do believe this, but they are wrong. And it is one of those things where I would say that this is a big thing, because you can look at it. It could undermine the atonement. You can't have sin, death, like all this stuff, like millions of layers. Like, let's say this is true, millions of layers of fossils, dinosaurs found with cancer and other things that they've been found with, and God said this is very good. That would imply that God created all of those things. That's insane. So here's the thing: animal death, human death doesn't happen until after Adam's sin.
That's right. That's right.
Everything is perfect, and that includes
That's right.
the angelic order in these first 6 days. What we see in Ezekiel, in fact, Lucifer is called the cherub that covers. Lucifer was originally created to be a cherubim who covered God's throne. With what purpose? If you read the descriptions of Ezekiel, he's covered with jewels and diamonds and all kinds of stuff, because he was meant to reflect God's glory. But the problem with Lucifer is he started seeing the glory that he was reflecting, and he wanted that for himself. And he became full of himself. And as it says in Isaiah, he tried to ascend. Remember the 7 I will statements? I will exalt my throne above the throne of God. He tries to climb into the mountain of the highest, and he is thrown down. So all of that, I would argue, happens after Genesis 6. It's a lot, though, and there is a lot of unknown with the angelic order that we don't understand. But that doesn't mean we have to make up fairy tales and throw them in between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 to try to explain it. Because what I notice from a lot of commentators who say these things is, I think, or I suppose, or I think it makes sense. I don't care what they think or what that makes sense. I care about what the Bible says. And
right.
so
That's right.
I hate to say it, like, opinions be left out. I mean, like, because we want to know what the Bible says. We don't want to care what someone is piecing together based on just different assumptions and things.
Thus
We want to know what
saith
the
the
Word
Lord.
says.
Thus
Yeah.
saith the Lord.
Yeah. So also 2 things. One is that if there is no gap, that eliminates a pre-Adamic society, but also
Wait, what?
A pre-Adamic race.
If there's no gap,
Correct.
that eliminates a
Adamic
pre-Adamic race.
Yeah,
Okay.
Adamic race.
So I had to follow that. Yeah.
Well,
Okay,
there
but-
is a gap theory that believes that there was people
But-
there.
That would
But
be
that-
theistic evolution. Yeah.
Yes.
That would be theistic evolution.
But
Yeah.
even so, what I guess what I'm go back to is Jesus himself is there is either a 6-day literal creation, or Jesus Christ himself lied when he made the parallel about the Sabbath. He rested on the Sabbath. He said God created in 6 literal days and then rested on the 7th.
Yeah.
And he affirms a 6-day creation in the New Testament. So either Jesus is lying to us,
Yeah.
or there's 6 24-hour days.
Jesus also says, in the beginning God made them male and female. That's a verse that, in fact, I've quoted in Matthew from when I've done weddings and stuff. If there is, like, if the evolutionary record, like there are Christians who try to fit that in, the evolutionary record suggests that humans slowly evolved from about 3.5 million years ago up until 250,000 years ago into what we call Cro-Magnons or Neanderthals, okay? God says in the beginning he made them male and female, talking about humans. And so if that was after 3.5 million years of evolution, would that really make it the beginning? And also, if the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, would that make it the beginning? No, it wouldn't. Jesus is saying in the beginning he's using these words on purpose because he is the creator of the Trinity. Okay, he is the one who is the creative member of the Trinity. He is using this word, in the beginning, God made them male and female. He's doing that for a reason. Not only to affirm that humans have been here since the beginning, but to affirm that male and female genders have existed from the beginning, that he created two genders. And, no fluidity there, by the way. But he created these things from the beginning. It was not a long process that brought humans here. It was him creating man out of the dust of the earth. So looking at this now, there are some people who look, let's focus in on Genesis 1-2 for a second. There are some people who look at Genesis 1-2 and they'll use the, I actually admittedly did not know the Hebrew words off the top of my head, but for without form and void. They look at these terms and what they basically mean is this, and I'll tell you how people try to spin these. Without form means without shape, okay? The earth, actually at this period in time, if you read it, it says the Spirit was moving over top of the waters. The earth would have been like a ball of water. It would have been a giant ocean. There were no continents. There was no form. There was no shape. Like now we see that there are continents, there's mountains, there's all this geology going on around us that didn't exist in the early earth, okay? Void means empty. There was no life. There was nothing. There was just a raging sea, essentially, just a giant ocean. There was no fish, no humans, no wildlife, nothing. And so that's the most basic interpretations. That's how Jewish scholarship is always interpreted, right? The earth is empty. It's without shape. What people came around and started saying with like Schofield and other people like that is they started coming around and they started saying, well, okay, there has to be millions of years in here. Okay, so when it says without form and void, they try to reinterpret those words as chaos, destruction.
Correct.
Why would they do that? They do that because they're trying to fit this narrative into Genesis that, okay, Satan rebelled here. The Bible really doesn't say that, but we kind of need it to happen because the Bible doesn't really mention it. And so it's like, this is when it would make most sense. It would also make sense for evolution. We can fit that in there. And so therefore, since Satan rebelled here, this and this must mean chaos, death, destruction, all these other words of just desolation and other things.
Right.
And they'll try to say that the earth was in this state of desolation after Satan rebelled, and now God has to recreate it. And I would argue to you that that's not the way that Jews interpreted this early on.
No.
Okay? That's not the tradition of Jewish scholarship. It's very obvious that people in the West, in the United States, created this theory to support their agenda of adding millions of years into the Bible. And I'm not trying to be rude, but it just is what it is.
Facts are facts.
It originated with people in the West trying to create ways to accommodate millions of years into the Jewish text of Genesis. Okay, and these words to imply that that's not what they mean. If you can look up the Hebrew on these. Now they are used in Job to describe civilization when it had been wiped out and other things like that.
That was Judah's destruction.
Yeah, to describe, there's some wording in Job as well that describes things being void and stuff like that. But that's why you have to understand context.
Right.
It's not saying we should, the word void is describing a city that was destroyed. I mean, obviously, if you go through and destroy a city and everybody's dead, you could say that city's void. But does that mean that completely determines how we should interpret what that word means in all cases? No, it just means that this is how one author is using it to describe a city that's been leveled. And it makes sense in the context. In this context, that's why you have to read it in the context of when it's used. It just literally means empty, okay? It doesn't imply all this death and chaos and stuff. It just means empty. Like when the church has nobody in it, it's void. That does not imply that the church is completely ransacked as if people came in and robbed it. It just means it's empty. It means there's nothing in here. there's no living people in here. Yeah.
Yeah, to support that, what you're saying, and that's Jeremiah 4:23.
Yeah.
That's the only other place you find the Hebrew tohu bohu, and it simply means
That's
without
right, Jeremiah. I was thinking Job for some reason.
Yeah, it was Jeremiah, but Jeremiah 4:23, and it simply means, if you look at the context, I'm glad you said that, because the context is, if you look at the entire chapter of 4, what's he talking about? He's talking about a future destruction of the land of Israel. Has nothing to do with utter, renovation or destruction or recreation. But they use that. They go, well, look, that's a picture of that, and it's not a picture of it. You have to read into it. The reason I'm glad he's parked on this for a moment, because this is where people try to inject theistic evolution into the Bible. And it's absolutely reprehensible. It does matter that we defend that. We can't stand for that.
I want to share with you. I want to share with you something really quick though, because we only have 5 minutes, but there is something I want to leave you with to think about here, because this is super important. So you said Genesis. I mean, obviously last week, foundation of every major biblical doctrine is in this section of Genesis. The other thing is, we know the past is objective.
Yep.
Past is real. We can figure out what happened based on what God said in His Word. And also, science means knowledge. So we're going to be talking about what actual science is. That would be knowledge, or some type of, when we think of science, we think of like a process of examining things to figure out through testing. But science can actually simply just mean knowledge as well. A historical science is using your means of examining a source to figure out what happened in the past. And that's what we're doing with Genesis. But so that's some of the things we talked about last week. We also said God created out of nothing. But I want you to focus on this word earth, because this is going to be big. Because there's 2 different ways you can look at this, and I don't think that either way is incorrect necessarily. Well, one has to actually be probably more right than the other, but I would say I kind of take a hybrid view between both, okay? So when it says that God created, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, we have the creation of time, we have the creation of space, and we have the creation of matter. We all learn that in science class. It's a basic, you learn that in 5th grade science, is that everything we see is either, it's within this time, space, matter universe, okay? And you learn about all the different properties of matter, solid, liquid, gas, all this different stuff, okay? I would argue to you, okay, so there's 2 different examples. If you go back, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. People have interpreted this as 2 different things, okay? So I'm going to put this on the board, actually, bear with me. This is for people online also. So there's 2 different ways we can look at the word earth. So earth could be interpreted as all matter, earth materials, or literally the planet Earth. Okay? So, is Earth capitalized? No. I was like, I had to think about that. Sometimes
it's proper if you're talking
yeah,
about the
maybe
earth.
it is.
Yeah, it is. Should be. If it's the earth,
we'll leave it for now.
It should
But
be.
yeah. So there are 2 ways people interpret this. Some people read Genesis 1 and they say, when it says God created the heavens and the earth, that's talking about literally the planet Earth. I like that interpretation. It's most basic. We live on Earth. They had a concept of like there are other planets and things. That's a concept that's been around. So I like that. Now the other one, the other interpretation. I'm trying to focus with the music. I struggle sometimes because I have major like focus issues sometimes. Like I just completely lost my train of thought. The other meaning, all matter, earth materials. It's also possible that when he says God created the heavens and the earth, he's talking about all physical matter in the universe. Okay, I don't have a problem with that interpretation either. I think either one could be correct. I would say this is probably more correct than this.
I agree.
Okay,
I agree.
I would say the second one's probably more correct.
I agree.
Yeah.
They're both
Planets.
correct.
All the other planets too?
Well, here's the
Follow
thing.
their heavens.
That's a good question, because here's the interesting thing. When he says created here, this is talking about out of nothing. So in later on, when you see about him making the planets, of making the sun, he created the stars, he made the stars. The word that's used there is not the same word that's used in Genesis 1, meaning he's not creating those stars out of nothing. He's using pre-existing materials that were already there, okay? So here's how I will tell you how I interpret this. I would say when it says God created the heavens and the earth, I think he literally means the planet Earth. But when he says the heavens, I would suggest that there is a crossover between heavens and earth. I would suggest he created all the materials that were used for the stars, for the planets. Every single physical thing in the entire universe was created at the initial moment of creation. And it was all together. Okay? So what that looks like, I don't know. But I think it's very obvious that all of these elemental atoms of the universe were all pushed together. Now, so that means the earth might look, and honestly, it could have been clumped up with the earth. We don't know that. Like, it could have been clumped up with the original earth. And then we do know from science and from the Bible, because Job talks about it, and Isaiah talks about it, it's like the heavens being spread out like a curtain. We know that the universe is expanding. We know God is stretching out the heavens like a curtain. So I think that at some point, I would say the beginning of creation, God created all of these earth materials. Now, whether they were like outside of the earth, just floating around in space, or if they were actually clumped together with the original earth, I don't think it matters either way. I think what I would say is that it probably makes most sense that they were just floating around in space, the atoms, like free atoms. He expands the universe, and then later on when it says he made the stars, he basically would have just taken all of those different elements and put them together and made what he literally wanted to make out of the building blocks that he created, okay? So it's like taking a series of Legos and just strewing them across the floor. You have a bunch of pieces floating around. The maker can go through and make whatever they want and put them wherever they want. That's how I see this creation, okay? And there is evidence that the stars are not billions of years old, by the way. And there's also some good explanations for like how we even see stars. Some people will look and say, well, starlight travels really, like it would take millions of years for starlight to hit the Earth. There are some good explanations for that, though, to show that starlight could actually get here a lot quicker. And actually, in fact, there's some really good young Earth creation science that shows that. And so
Are you talking about time dilation?
there's two different models.
Okay.
Yeah, two different models. There's time flowing differently, and there's also speed of light could be variable.
Yeah.
And then the other one is that
It doesn't have to be
light,
constant.
Light might travel. It's constant, but it might travel
I
different
meant
speeds in different directions.
That's what I meant.
Yeah.
Two different directions,
Yeah,
correct.
yeah. So we can get into the technical aspects of that. So for those who are joining us online and just everybody who's going to join us today, it is kind of impossible to go through and like defend Genesis and look at this and tear this apart without getting into some pretty heavy stuff. So each week with Genesis, especially early on, we are going to be getting into some pretty heavy duty stuff, talking about some very deep things, at least these first early weeks on. But I really want you to consider this for next week, because I want to present a few things to you science-wise that I think the Bible confirms based on this. So, all right, for everybody, sorry if that was too much. Everybody online, thank you for joining us. It's awesome to have you guys here, and God bless you guys. We'll see you next week.